Hello, my name is Roger Watson and welcome to this session on the respiratory system. The respiratory system is comprised of the lungs, the ribs and the bronchial tree. The purpose of the respiratory system is to deliver oxygen to and remove carbon dioxide from the bloodstream. The respiratory system also plays a significant role in maintaining the pH of the blood. And this diagram summarises the respiratory system. In the lungs, oxygen is taken up by haemoglobin in the blood and carbon dioxide is given off, and in the body tissues, oxygen is given off by haemoglobin and carbon dioxide is taken into the bloodstream, and this works in a cycle to deliver oxygen to the body tissues and to take carbon dioxide away. You might want to have a look at this Bozeman Biology YouTube link on the respiratory system. This diagram shows the main components of the respiratory system. Starting at the top, we have the nasal cavity. Mostly we breathe in, or we should breathe in, through our noses. Then at the back of the throat, the soft area called the pharynx. Then below that, the larynx, which is the voice box, then the trachea, and then the bronchi, and then the smaller subdivisions into the bronchioles, leading into the two lungs, one on the left, one on the right. You'll notice that the lungs are surrounded by the rib cage, and below them lies the diaphragm. And this shows the respiratory tree. It also shows the lungs. In more detail, you can see that there are lobes in the lungs, 2 on the left and 3 on the right. Having lobes makes it slightly more efficient to deliver oxygen to the lungs rather than delivering it to one large organ. The structure is described as the respiratory tree. If you turned it upside down, you could imagine it like a tree. Essentially, the tubes which deliver oxygen from the nasal cavity into the lungs subdivide into smaller and smaller divisions, from the bronchi into the bronchioles, and then there are primary, secondary and tertiary bronchi. And the functional unit and the end of the tertiary bronchi are the pulmonary alveoli. These are areas where the actual oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange takes place. Here we see that the bronchi are surrounded by a network of capillaries. Red capillaries which are oxygenated and the blue ones which are deoxygenated. In this case, the deoxygenated ones are carrying blood to this area and the oxygenated ones are carrying blood away. The alveoli are 1 cell thick, so diffusion of gas across them in both directions is relatively easy. Next we'll look at what is sometimes called respiration, but which is strictly speaking external respiration or breathing, and this is achieved by means mainly of the rib cage, and that is the main function of the rib cage. It's not a protective system, it's a system that's there to help us to breathe, as we'll see. Breathing is achieved as the rib cage moves up and down. The rib cage is raised by the intercostal muscles and lowered automatically. Sometimes during forced expiration or in some lung disease, the intercostal muscles are required to force the expiration as well. This movement is known as the bucket handle movement, and we can see why. The movement of the ribs is rather like a bucket handle being raised up and down. So if we look carefully at this diagram, which shows inhalation or breathing in and exhalation, we see what happens. The 3 components that are required here are the rib cage, which we've already met, the diaphragm, which is a skeletal muscle at the bottom of the ribs. This is a unique skeletal muscle in that we can, like all skeletal muscles, control it voluntarily, but only up to some extent, and normally we don't have to control it during normal breathing. There's another aspect here which is shown light blue, and that is the intrapleural space. That's the space between the outside tissue of the lungs and the lung lining, or the lining of the rib cage. And in there, please note the negative pressure that exists. If that pressure isn't negative, then the lungs wouldn't remain expanded. The lungs are not physically attached to the ribs. They merely expand due to that negative pressure in there relative to the positive pressure inside them. If that negative pressure is compromised in any way, for example, if the lung is punctured, then the lung will collapse. So during inhalation, sometimes called inspiration, the rib cage is raised, the diaphragm is flattened, and this decreases the pressure inside the lung relative to atmospheric pressure, and air is sucked in. During exhalation, the rib cage collapses, the diaphragm relaxes and moves up, and air is pushed out because there's a positive pressure inside the lungs compared with atmospheric pressure. So this shows the lungs collapsing, the diaphragm moving up, and the air being forced out of the lungs. While the main organs of breathing are the ribs and the rib cage, there are also accessory muscles of respiration. You don't need to know the name of these, but these are muscles which lie at the top of the rib cage around the neck. We don't normally need to use them except during strenuous exercise and often during illness, particularly respiratory illness. And if someone is seen to be using these respiratory muscles or these accessory muscles of respiration, then it can be an indication that they're struggling to breathe properly. This rather complicated looking diagram, at first glance at any rate, is a very important conceptual diagram in respiration, and it shows the lung volumes and capacities. The total lung capacity, shown second right, is around 6 litres. However, the vital capacity, which is the capacity from the most forced exhalation to the most forced inhalation, is around 5 litres. There's always a residual volume shown at the bottom there, which we cannot exhale due to the elasticity of the lungs and the fact that they have to remain slightly inflated to function. They never collapse completely, and they're held open by the negative pressure in the intrapleural space. Tidal volume shown on the right, and that's the narrowest wavy line in the narrowest light blue area, is the volume of air moved in and out of the lungs during normal breathing. That's approximately 500 mils. All the rest of this is really self-explanatory. It shows the different names for the different volumes when we inhale completely and when we exhale completely under normal breathing. Don't worry too much about memorizing every aspect of this diagram. The important things to grasp are the total lung capacity, the vital capacity, and the tidal volume. So gas exchange at the alveoli. The alveoli are surrounded, as we see here, by a network of capillaries. A pulmonary arteriole arrives, breaks down into capillaries, and a pulmonary venule leaves, carrying deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, respectively. And here we can see very schematically what happens from the top. Blood flows in from the top there, deoxygenated, showing blue cells, and gradually becomes more oxygenated, showing red cells. Carbon dioxide is pushed out where the deoxygenated blood cells come in, and oxygen is taken up into the cells from the alveoli. And here we see how gas exchange is achieved. Essentially, at the deoxygenated end of this system, this is the blood that's arriving at the lungs, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is greater than the partial pressure inside the alveolus, and carbon dioxide is diffused in through simple diffusion into the alveolus, and the opposite happens regarding oxygen. The oxygen partial pressure in the alveolus is much greater than in the blood that's arriving at the alveolus, and therefore oxygen diffuses in, again through simple diffusion. So the blood that enters has a lower oxygen content than the blood that leaves, but a higher carbon dioxide content than the blood that leaves the alveolus. And that's a much simpler schematic diagram, and that's really all you need to know. Low O2 at one end, high CO2, the opposite at the other. We've already met the erythrocyte and its unique properties, and the fact that it's packed full of a protein called haemoglobin. Well, haemoglobin carries oxygen molecules, and it can carry, each molecule of haemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules, due to a particular group in the middle called a heme group containing iron. That shows the structure in slightly more detail. That heme group shown round and red there looks chemically like this. Don't worry too much about that, of course, but the fact it contains iron in the middle is important. The iron changes valency and can bind and release the oxygen depending on the prevalent conditions. That's why iron is so important to the function of the blood in carrying oxygen. A shortage of iron can lead to anemia. This is another very important conceptual diagram in respiration, and it's the oxygen-haemoglobin dissociation curve. It looks complicated at first. However, the important thing to note is that as the curve moves to the right, the affinity for oxygen decreases and the partial pressure of oxygen can be increased in the surrounding tissues, or in this case in the blood. So under conditions where there is increased temperature or increased carbon dioxide, for example in exercise, and increased diphosphoglycerate, which is a byproduct of metabolism, or a decreased pH, which indicates raised hydrogen ions, then the oxygen-haemoglobin dissociation curve can move to the right and make more oxygen available. Next, we'll look at the regulation of blood pH, and this is the pH-CO2 link. Essentially, we want to maintain the pH of the blood in that normal range in the middle, outside of which, if the number of hydrogen ions increases or the number of hydroxide ions increases too much, then cells will die. And central to this process is the production of carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is produced when carbon dioxide and water are produced by the internal respiration of the cells. This is due to the metabolic activity of the cells. Carbon dioxide and water can combine to form carbonic acid, which can then break down to form hydrogen ions, which tend to lead to acidity, and bicarbonate ions. Clearly, the higher the levels of carbon dioxide, the higher the levels of hydrogen ions. This reaction is under the control of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which is ubiquitous in the body. There are 2 situations that can arise: respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. We'll look at these in turn. First, let's take a look at respiratory acidosis. This is caused by increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the blood, for example by hyperventilation, which can take place during pyrexia or raised body temperature. And this leads to respiratory acidosis, in other words, increased levels of hydrogen ions in the blood by the mechanism which we saw in the previous slide. This is picked up by chemoreceptors in various parts of the body, which send signals to the respiratory centre in the medulla, and this increases respiratory rate, and that leads to decreased carbon dioxide because the carbon dioxide gets blown off at the lungs. This works alongside other mechanisms, for example renal mechanisms, which we'll come to look at later, and also buffering systems in the blood. And this returns the situation to homeostatic levels of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions in the blood. Contrast this with respiratory alkalosis, which ironically can also be caused by hyperventilation because carbon dioxide levels are dropped and hydrogen ion levels drop and hydroxyl ions rise, leading to respiratory alkalosis. This is also mediated via the respiratory centres and leads to decreased respiratory rate, and also renal compensation and buffering systems help to return the system to a situation of homeostasis. So the respiratory system is comprised of the lungs, the ribs and the bronchial tree. The purpose of the respiratory system is to deliver oxygen to and remove carbon dioxide from the bloodstream. The respiratory system also plays a significant role in maintaining the pH of the blood. Now some questions. 1. In terms of the structures that air passes through as you breathe in, put the following in the correct order: lungs, nasal cavity, bronchi and trachea. 2. What are the two phases of activity in the lungs? Which structures does air pass through after the bronchi? What are the functional units of the lungs? 3. What is the major constituent of air? Which constituent of air is accumulated in the blood at the alveoli? Which constituent of air is removed from the blood at the alveoli? What is the exchange of these constituents called? 4. What happens at inspiration? 5. Describe the structure of the alveoli. By what processes is oxygen and carbon dioxide exchanged at the alveoli? Here's my email for any questions or comments. I don't expect you to be able to answer all of those questions from the material in the lecture. I expect you to look up some material by yourself. Some of these answers can be found in my blog 4 Things About, a simple approach to anatomy and physiology, under the entry The Respiratory System. Thank you very much for listening.